This is In-Ear Insights, the Trust Insights podcast. In this week's In-Ear Insights, we're talking strategy and stack drift. So if you've never heard the term before, it's because I just made it up. Stack drift. I'll back up. I was spending some time this past weekend looking at my own MarTech stack. I have my own newsletter and a personal website, and I was looking through my instance of Tag Manager, and there was just a lot of cruft that had accumulated, some optimizations I hadn't done, a server I hadn't upgraded, and a bunch of these little technologies and services. And what I realized was that I had set up all this stuff, back when we were working at our old company and things, and I had a very specific strategy. And that strategy was, I want to build a lifeboat for myself in case the company we were working at didn't work out. I want to have something that was my own. And that worked really well to build my personal brand. Well, obviously, in the 3 years since that, we've founded Trust Insights together. The company I now work for is one that I actually believe in. And so the urgency of having that lifeboat is much less. And so I had all this extra marketing technology that was misaligned with my new strategy. My new strategy is to promote the company because you and I co-own this thing. Mm-hmm. And so there isn't a need for it to be as church and state as it used to be. And so all these retargeting technologies and stuff, I just started turning things off, like, oh, I don't need that anymore. I had some honest discussions with myself, like, oh, look, there's my Facebook retargeting pixel. How many Facebook ads have I run in the last 3 years? 0. Off. Right. And so it was kind of an eye-opener to go, wow, this MarTech stack is a snapshot of where my mind was 3 years ago, or more than that in some cases, but it's so out of alignment now with my current strategy that I really should have turned off a whole bunch of things a long time ago.
It's interesting. It's this whole notion of letting go. And so it's the same, like I equate it to when, people are asked to, audit their closets and what things do you need to let go of. And so, this was something that I love throwing things out. Like, I think it's the greatest thing. And I'm not just like throwing things out, like I'll donate them, I'll recycle them. So let's be clear about that. But, it just frees up space for new things, for other things. And so what I often see when, if I'm working with someone, either like to audit their technology, audit their teams, or even just like audit their closet, it's, well, what if I want it tomorrow? What if I need it next week? Well, I know I haven't touched it in 6 years, but I just remembered that I have it. What if I suddenly want it again? And so it's interesting that you're describing, where your mind was 3 years ago versus where it is today. And you're right, it is a very different place. A lot has happened. And first and foremost, I applaud you for just like letting things go and shutting them off, because it doesn't mean that you've deleted them forever. You could turn things back on if you need them. But for right now, it's just taking up space. And I think that that's one of the things that companies need to do a better job of, especially when it comes to their MarTech stack, because priorities change, teams change, technologies change, processes change. But if your tech stack doesn't also change, then you've basically just spent all of that time planning and, plotting and, saying you're going to do the thing. But it's to your point, it's a misalignment. And so, is there a good time frame to do that? Like, is there like a cycle or a seasonality? And two, why do you think people have such a hard time of letting go of some of that old stuff, Chris?
I think part of it is fear. What if I do need this? It's the same reason that you keep all these things. Some things, less so with marketing technology. I mean, some people like have stuff because of sentimental value, right? Nostalgia and things like, oh, this was my high school yearbook. That doesn't apply for MarTech for the most part. I mean, I guess you could really love a piece of technology, but probably not. But I think it does come down to fear and a whole bunch of like, what if? Well, what if this happens? Well, what if this happens? I won't have these things. And in the case of marketing technology, a lot of the time, each of these little services is relatively little money. And so you think of it in its own little domain. Like, oh, this is only $49 a month. Well, $49 a month times 20 services adds up after a while, but we don't necessarily think that way. We consider each item discretely as opposed to collectively, what is this thing costing? In my case, it was actually page speed. So even though Tag Manager runs asynchronously, there's still things that run as your page loads, and it takes time for the container itself to finish firing. And so one of the things I wanted to do is, okay, well, what can I do to make my personal website run faster? Well, probably turn off the 40 tracking pixels that we're launching each time. We ran into this last week with the Trust Insights newsletter and social media accounts. Our link shortener is working fine, but the retargeting audience we were using was breaking. And I had another sit down moment of, have we ever run an ad through these retargeting pixels? Like, we've been accumulating this audience for 3 years. I'm like, no, we never have once used these tracking pixels for the intended purpose. So I just pulled that out of our code and like, okay, we're not going to do that anymore, because it's an added step. It's an added vulnerability to the system. And it's something else can break, and it's not as good an experience. And now things run a little bit faster, but there's one less dependency. One of the things that I feel like it was part of this mindset is, when I look at the world and see how much of the world's supply chains are breaking right now between hurricanes and canal closures and stuck boats and pandemics, people are realizing just how interconnected everything is and how exposed you are to other people's risks. So if we can do that with our own marketing technology stacks, and just how much risk can we reduce of something else breaking that may or may not add a whole lot of value? It's kind of like what you talk about a lot, Katie, which is, what's the risk versus what's the reward? If there's minimal reward and substantial risk, get rid of it.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to approach thinking about your MarTech stack. And so I want to go back to something that you just said that just really struck a chord with me, which was, being dependent on other people's stuff and their risk. And so if their stuff is breaking, and so, it's interesting. Very few companies, ours included, can 100% make their own stuff. And so we don't necessarily have the resources to make our own CMS or our own, email marketing software. And so we are reliant on other companies to provide that piece of technology. But to your point, Chris, the more different things you have, the more vulnerable you are if something happens with that company, especially if you don't have a good sense of what touches what goes where, and the breakdown. And so it sounds like what you're describing is, what would be helpful is some sort of a governance plan to understand what you have, what it does, who owns it, both internally and externally, and then some kind of business continuity planning of, let's say, for instance, so we use Mautic, and Mautic is, a fairly complex system for a non-technology person, but the trade-off is that it's open source and you have control over the code in it. So we use that for our email marketing. Something that we would need to factor in is the risk and reward. So while we have more control over it, the risk is if you, Chris, suddenly decide you don't want to do it anymore, or if Mautic suddenly shuts down everything, we need to figure out what's our backup plan. Where do we move to? And so it's just, there's nothing for us to do with it today, but having a full understanding of, okay, if Mautic suddenly goes away, what does that mean for our email marketing? What can we pick it up and run it through a different system tomorrow? If not, what does that mean? So just understanding how all of those different pieces connect, especially when we think about, our customer journey and our attribution model. Email is such a big channel for us that it would be a huge problem if that suddenly went away, or if something broke, even, for a few days or a week. That's a lot of our traffic and conversions that we would lose.
It is. One of the reasons actually for Mautic was well, a big part was cost, obviously, because it's substantially less expensive. But there is that element of the fact that it's open source software that we run on our own server. It is
Mhm.
not something that is a cloud-based service. So if it breaks, it's my fault. It's not the vendor's fault. Whereas, like, if you're using, say, like a Mailchimp and they have a service outage, you can't do anything about it. Like, you're stuck until they come back online. And so, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago with a system like Matomo sort of being your backup to Google Analytics,
Mhm.
you should, if resources permit, have an open source self-hosted alternative waiting in the wings, like a disaster recovery kit ready to go in case a
Mhm.
primary system goes down. Now, in the case of the strategy question, right now, the use of Mautic as our marketing automation system really is a central part of our strategy. Like you said, it's
Mhm.
where like close to 70% of our conversions come from. Um, a big thing that we have to be looking at is, what do we need to be doing to diversify that so that we're not so reliant on the one channel? Because right now, it actually is a very good reflection of our strategy. Our strategy is build a really good audience and
Mhm.
then try to monetize as best as we can. I don't see that changing, but what I do think is an issue is how can we get more than one channel that we own
Mhm.
integrated into our customers' lives. So we have Slack,
Mhm.
the free Slack group, Analytics for Marketers, which you go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. You can join there with 1,900 other marketers. Yeah, commercial plug over. We don't we don't do anything with Discord right now. It's something to think about. I don't know that our
Mhm.
audience is there. We don't do anything with text messaging, and the reason for that is it's substantially more costly.
Mhm.
Email is fundamentally free, and obviously we have our various email publications. But the other question is, what else could we be doing um, in something that we own that would be aligned with our strategy, and what technologies do we need to do that? Because one of the mistakes that I know I've made a ton of times is I pick the technology before I pick the strategy, and then the strategy kind of evolves out of the it's like, you buy a certain number of appliances, then you can cook whatever you can make with those appliances, as opposed to saying I'm going to cook sushi, and then you get the appropriate equipment to do it.
For those of you who are listening and not watching it on YouTube, you definitely missed some of the faces that I was just making when Chris was describing that he picks the technology and then he picks the strategy. And so, I think it's fair. I think that's a classic problem because it's a very common approach, and it's not the band-aid approach. It's the, okay, we need to run email. Let's get an email marketing piece of software versus let's step back and look at everything holistically. What do we already have and what do we want to do? And then we can fill in the gaps. And so that's something that, you know, we, Trust Insights, you and I, Chris, should be doing a little bit more of moving into next year of, okay, we know where we're at today. We know that we are over indexed on email. So here's some other alternatives and here's some directions we want to go in. What do we already have? I would I would go ahead and say we probably already have all the tools we need to diversify our strategy. What we don't have is the actual, like, here's what we're going to do with these tools. Um, maybe it's, increasing our content production. So we already have a lot of content through the newsletter, but maybe it's, getting that content out into different channels. And so we already have all the stuff to do that. But I think what happens a lot of time is, if we were in an enterprise size company, for example, where it's harder to see all of the different moving pieces and we're kind of just sort of siloed, we might say, okay, we want to increase content production. Well, I don't know what we have. So let's just go ahead and get some kind of content marketing software, whatever that is. Let's get a bunch of writers, let's get a new CMS, let's do all the things so that we can produce content. When in actuality, you already have a lot of content that you can repurpose and refresh. You own your search because you control what people are searching for. You control the content that you're producing, and you don't necessarily need a whole bunch of new writers. So it's really, instead of thinking about it of let's create a new strategy, it's the reverse of let's audit what we already have and what do we already have to work with and then fill in the gaps. I was commenting before we started recording this podcast today that I do think strategic planning, and I'm putting this in big air quotes, in some ways is kind of bullshit. And the reason I say that is because companies use it as the clean slate. Let's start over. Let's forget everything that happened in the past. It doesn't matter. We're going to start fresh with a brand new strategy, and we're going to, just disregard everything that we already have. And I feel like that's the wrong mindset to go into thinking about what you want to do next year. And so it's really ideally what it should be is, here's all the good stuff that we have. Is it working? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to just move in a slightly different direction? And let's not make a big deal out of it. Let's just go ahead and start doing the thing. And I think this idea of strategic planning becomes such a big, blown up, like has to be meetings and days and workshops and this and that and outings and events. Like, just go do something.
I think that you're right. Strategic planning is almost like trying to do too much all at once. It's like you're going to quit smoking and lose weight and start working out and go to church and stop beating your spouse all at the same time. And it's all these things. It's too much change all at once. Whereas if you think about like cooking, I'm going to go back to cooking. You have your recipe, you have your ingredients, you have your tools, you have your talent. These four big things. Changing all of them by saying, now we're going to be a sushi restaurant. We were a pancake place yesterday. Now we're just serving sushi. It seems like a really big leap that you're probably going to fall on your face. As opposed to saying, okay, here's what we have for tools. Here's what we have for ingredients. Here's what we have for people. And what you're saying, at least what I hear you saying, is what other recipes could we cook with what we've got? What else could we cook? So we serve waffles, but we haven't served pancakes. We could try doing burgers. I mean, burgers are functionally not a whole lot different. You need you don't need the waffle iron for everything, but if you have a griddle, you can make burgers pretty easily. It's still a piece of it's round food, so just sort of stacked together. It's a slightly different format.
I do not want you to do marketing for my restaurant, Chris.
Welcome to Katie's Round Objects. But the point being this, it's less of a pivot and it's less culture shock for the people. It's less expense because you're not going to have to throw out a whole bunch of tools. And it's less pain when particularly in data-driven marketing, we're basically saying, like, if you make that big strategic leap, great. All the data you have so far, then you have to throw out. If you've changed your strategy that much, then all the information you've collected probably isn't valid for the new scenario. Whereas if you're saying, okay, we are a communications company that uses we sell cell phones. Well, maybe you sell text messaging now too. Maybe you sell monitoring your vehicle. Like, hey, here's a transmitter you put in your vehicle. Still uses the cell network. Still uses the data plan. Still uses all the infrastructure you've got. But it's another value add for service. It's just a different recipe with the same thing. And I think if you approach strategic planning that way and saying, what recipes do we have? Are they selling well? Like, nobody wants pickle waffles, so we should probably take that off the menu. What else could we put on in its place? Then you could try and find what customers might actually want.
That's exactly it. I really like that analogy of, what recipes you're already cooking and what other recipes haven't you tried that you can make with the same things. And maybe you add one or two different elements, but you're not overhauling everything all at once. And so to go back to where we started the conversation, which was the MarTech stack and the stack drift, so where you were, 3-6 years ago and where you are today is different mentally, but at the core of it, you're not doing different kinds of work. You're still doing the same attribution analysis, predictive analysis, machine learning, data crunching, all those things. You're still doing that. And so you're taking all the same ingredients and tools, you're just looking at it differently now. And so I think that's, as you were going through, I'm like, okay, I am no longer going to make pickle waffles I no longer need pickles. So therefore I'm going to shut off the Facebook, retargeting pixel. You know, I think it's the same thing. You're not necessarily tossing out all of that data. You're just saying, I'm just going to put this aside for now. I don't need it to be constantly on the shelf and in my way and running. I'm just going to, stick it over there. If you did decide all of a sudden, like let's say 6 years ago, you were like, I'm only ever going to do Facebook ads. That's it. That's all I'm ever going to do. And today you're like, I haven't touched Facebook ads in 6 years. Then that is a different conversation. And you do need to think about like, okay, but what am I doing instead? Do I have all the right tools? Do I need to sunset these things? And to your point, Chris, what do I do with all of that data that I collected? And that goes into, that strategic planning, for moving forward. Like I have all this stuff. What else can I do with it? So I've collected all of this data for 6 years. Is there anything valuable there? Is there anything I can repurpose with it? As opposed to what I see a lot of companies do is let's start fresh. And I think it's that start fresh mentality that really bugs me because you waste so much time and energy and money trying to start fresh versus using what you already have to just slightly adjust.
And this is the corollary to our live stream from a couple of weeks ago of solutions in search of a problem, which is if you've got the stuff and you're already making waffles and things, it's okay to see, okay, well, let's try making pancakes. They're structurally similar enough and see if there's a there. It's sort of the R&D side of things. If you're looking at your MarTech stack and you've got all these tools, ask yourself, is there something else that you could make with it that would be more valuable to what you're doing? And if there isn't, like in my case with Facebook retargeting pixels, like, yep, in all honesty, I'm not going to run any Facebook ads. I don't want to give a dime to that company because I don't particularly like them or trust them, and so I'm okay just turning off. I'm not going to make Facebook waffles. Just take that out of the contention entirely, and that, to your point, makes room. Certainly cleans up Tag Manager a whole lot, and it also helps clarify strategy because. If there's a choice that's out there, even if it's a false choice, it still costs you mental bandwidth to say, oh, well, what if we did this? Well, no, take that off the table. Pretend it's just not there. Now you have fewer choices, but they're more valid choices, and it's easier to make choices from what's left, as opposed to saying, well, here's all the things we could possibly make, and then getting distracted.
It reminds me, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and her company is going through a MarTech stack overhaul, essentially. And so, this notion of single view of the customer is very, hot right now. It's one of the key buzzwords that everybody's talking about. And I asked her, I'm like, well, what does that mean? What are you doing? And so they're going from like 12 different tech stack systems down to one. And I looked at her, I'm like, that's a behemoth of a project. Like, good luck. Because they're going from systems like Salesforce and Constant Contact and, start listing off all the key players down to one single system that is meant to do all the things. And I know these systems well enough to know that that's not necessarily true. And so I think that also sort of factors into the conversation, of thinking through what do you have, what do you want to do? But then you need to do your research and due diligence. So there's two sides of that conversation. One is, can you condense down your systems with the stuff that you already have because you haven't explored all of the functionality of your existing systems? And, or if you're moving to a new system, does it do exactly what it is you need it to do? Or are you just saying, okay, that's the one that everybody uses, I need to use that as well. And then you get in it and realize that you have to pay by the feature, or the feature or the functionality that you wanted just truly doesn't exist. I was talking with my mother-in-law last week, and she was duped into buying one of those tablet/laptops that when you close the lid, it turns into a tablet, because she wanted to read her books on the tablet and not have to bring a separate e-reader. And so she thrust it at me and was like, why doesn't it work? You fix this now. So I was like, okay, let me take a look at it. And I spent about 30 seconds Googling the problem. And it, unfortunately, with that particular laptop, it was a little bit of a bait and switch. When they promoted the laptop, they said it will do the thing, but the feature itself was never rolled out. And so she purchased this machine that doesn't do what it is she wants it to do. So now she's stuck with a piece of hardware that she can't use because it doesn't let, and it just, I see this with MarTech stack decisions as well, is you don't do enough of the research. You don't ask the question to say, will it do what I need it to do?
Yep. Get your mother-in-law an iPad.
I got enough going on. I don't need to be her tech support.
Yeah. So to conclude, your strategy probably should come first, and then look at your stack and see what of those things lines up with it. What of those things could line up with it, and then what are those things that frankly just aren't in on the path that you're going, and then as best as possible leave those things behind as quickly as you can if they're costing you money, and then remove them from your strategy with the understanding that a lot of these things are cloud-based services. So if you change your mind or you change strategies, you can always go back. You can always, you'll have a data gap, but that's not the end of the world. But definitely do some house cleaning. We're it's September 1. It's back to school. Clean out the kids' backpack, dump all the crap that they left in there. In May or June when they stop going to school. Put everything fresh and give yourself that fresh start on your marketing technology as you head into the fourth quarter and the end of the year. If you got questions or comments about anything we've talked about today, hop on over to our free Slack group, Analytics for Marketers. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 1,900 other folks are talking about all things marketing and analytics related. And wherever it is that you're watching or listening to the show, if there's a channel you prefer to have it on, we probably have it. Go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where you can see all of the options. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Need help making your marketing platforms, processes, and people work smarter? Visit trustinsights.ai today and learn how we can help you deliver more impact.